Before we begin, do you enjoy these long, calming journeys into forgotten corners of history? Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating these hours of quiet storytelling. As always, I'd love to know what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from tonight? Share it in the comments below, and let's see how far across the map our quiet community stretches. Asterisk. The year is 1861. You find yourself not on the battlefield yet, but in the quiet, in-between spaces where ordinary men became soldiers. You imagine the world around you. Damp hearth, canvas tents straining in the wind, and the faint rattle of tin cups as men rise from uneasy sleep. You hear the first sounds of the day. A bugle breaks the silence before dawn, its notes carrying over rows of tents pitched in muddy fields. The soldier's life, for many, was not defined by the roar of cannons, but by the routine of mornings like this, rising before the sun, folding blankets still damp with dew, and lining up for roll call while the cold pressed against their bones. The American Civil War drew in millions of men, most of whom had never traveled far from home. They arrived in camps in rough homespun clothing, carrying whatever they could from their family farms. Some wore heavy wool suits, others brought wide-brimmed hats, while many marched in shoes already worn thin from the road. Uniforms, neat and official in theory, were scarce in practice. Soldiers on both sides often began the war in mismatched clothing, sometimes even mistaken for the enemy. It was only later, after months of supply chains struggling to catch up, that the image of the Union's blue and the Confederacy's gray became fixed in the public mind. Breakfast was rarely warm. Soldiers might eat hardtack tins, dry biscuits that could last months without spoiling. They gnawed on them carefully, sometimes breaking teeth on the rock-hard surface. To soften them, men soaked a hardtack in coffee or fried them in bacon. Grease, when supplies allowed. Salt pork was issued fatty, often rancid meat that tasted of brine. A soldier who had grown up on fresh farm meals now learned the monotony of preserved rations. Fresh fruit and vegetables were luxuries, almost mythical in the camps. The smell of coffee was perhaps the one comfort. Beans were issued in raw form, and soldiers roasted and ground them themselves, brewing the bitter drink in tin cups over open fires. Diaries from the time show men writing with gratitude about coffee, calling it the fuel that kept them standing. The Confederacy, blockaded by Union ships, often could not get coffee at all. Southern soldiers substituted roasted acorns, chicory, root, or dandelion, creating brews that looked like coffee but never truly matched the taste. After breakfast, drills began. Hours of marching in formation, shouldering rifles, practicing the loading motions again and again. A soldier carried his musket-offen, a Springfield or Enfield rifle, alongside a cartridge box, bayonet, and haversack. Altogether, the gear weighed nearly 50 pounds. To march in wool uniforms beneath the southern sun or through the damp forests of Virginia was exhausting. Yet discipline demanded repetition, as officers believed the ability to load and fire in unison would decide battles more than bravery alone. Hygiene in camp was poor. Soldiers washed rarely, clothes went unchanged for weeks, and lice thrived in the folds of fabric. Men scratched constantly, sometimes joking in letters about graybacks, as though speaking of fellow campmates. Latrines were shallow pits, often dug too close to drinking water. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, typhoid, measles, and smallpox claimed more lives than musket balls. In fact, of the roughly 620,000 deaths in the Civil War, nearly two-thirds came from illness. Evenings brought moments of relief. Soldiers sat around fires, carving wood into small trinkets, playing cards, or writing letters by candlelight. Writing became a ritual. Families back home waited anxiously for news, and soldiers filled page after page with mundane details: the weather, the food, the names of friends. These small reports connected to worlds the battlefield, canned the farmstead, and reminded each man of why he endured. Music also threaded through the camps. Fiddles, banjos, and harmonicas appeared, carried from home or traded along the way. Soldiers sang folk tunes, patriotic anthems, and sometimes songs borrowed from the other side. Music blurred the lines of division, for many melodies were shared across North and South long before war drew borders. When battle finally came, soldiers often described the strangest contrast: the long, dull stretches of camp life shattered suddenly by the chaos of combat. A day that began with hardtack and drills might end with deafening artillery and clouds of smoke. The shift from monotony to terror was almost unbearable. But even in the quiet danger lurked. Scouts, pickets, and sudden skirmishes kept nerves taut. Sleep was light, disturbed by the fear of being surprised in the night. The emotional burden of soldiering weighed heavily. Many were young boys of 17, some even younger, with parents' consent. They wrote about missing their mothers, about dreaming of home-cooked meals, about wondering whether they would ever return. Some admitted, openly in diaries, that they cried quietly at night, their pride hidden in the dark. The Civil War soldier was not a constant hero, but an ordinary man pressed into extraordinary hardship. And yet, amid the filth, hunger, and fear, a strange resilience grew. Men found comfort in small rituals: the way they packed their haversack, the exact order in which they cleaned their rifle, the prayer said before bed. These little acts of routine gave a sense of control when the wider world spun violently beyond their grasp. In the end, life of a Civil War soldier was not made of glorious charges or famous speeches. It was made of waiting, of hunger, of lice, of the taste of burnt coffee in a dented cup. It was made of the long silence of dawn before the bugles sounded again. And so, you might wonder, in a war remembered for its great battles, how much of it was truly lived in those small, quiet, and almost invisible moments between the fighting. Asterisk, the bugle call that began each morning was more than just sound. It was structure. In an environment where men were far from home, where fear lingered at the edges of thought. The rhythm of military routine was both burden and anchor. After weeks in camp, a soldier's body came to anticipate the timing. The rattle of mess tins at dawn, the drill calls by mid-morning, the measured step of marching practice in the heat of the day. Yet monotony carried its own weight. Days blurred together into endless cycles of the same meals, the same drills, the same inspections. Soldiers often wrote in their diaries about boredom as much as about fear. Nothing new today appears again and again in letters sent home. The human mind, deprived of stimulation, found its own escape jokes, songs, carved initials in wooden fence posts, or careful sketches in the margins of letters. Some men whittled sticks into pipes. Others spent hours teaching one another to read or write, for literacy was not universal. The physical environment of camp life was harsh. Campsites were chosen quickly, often near rivers or roads, but with little thought for sanitation. The ground grew muddy after rain, turning tents into damp hollows that smelled of mildew. In summer, heat pressed heavily upon wool uniforms, soaking them in sweat. In winter, frost stiffened shoes, and breath clouded the air within canvas shelters that offered little warmth. Fire could heat one side of the body, while the other side froze. Medical understanding of health was rudimentary. Men knew little about germs, and officers prioritized military order over sanitation. As a result, disease swept through regiments. Diarrhea and dysentery were common, reducing strong men to weakness. Typhoid fever stalked the camps, transmitted through water. Soldiers sometimes lay sick on the ground with little care tended. only by comrades who themselves lacked medicine. Quinine, used against malaria, was in short supply. Morphine, when available, dulled pain but risked addiction. Yet in the midst of hardship, soldiers found camaraderie. Letters often described the bonds between men in a company as closer than family. Shared suffering created trust. When one soldier fell ill, others gave up their rations or brewed coffee for him. When lice tormented the tents, men laughed together at the scratching contests. Even nicknames, sometimes mocking, sometimes affectionate, gave a sense of belonging. The ordinary man alone would have faltered. In the company of others, he endured. Weapons training was a daily burden. The process of loading a musket was slow and exacting, requiring up to 9 steps: tearing the cartridge with teeth, coring powder, placing the bullet, ramming it home, priming the cap, and firing. Soldiers practiced until their fingers worked, mechanically, often in unison with dozens of others. For new recruits, the repetition was tedious. For veterans, it was survival. A soldier who could load and fire. Marches were perhaps the greatest test of endurance. Soldiers sometimes marched 20 miles in a single day, carrying their rifles, knapsacks, and gear. Roads were little more than rutted dirt paths. In rain, they became seas of mud that sucked at boots. In heat, dust choked throats and left men parched. Feet blistered and bled. Many men discarded extra clothing and blankets along the roadside, unable to bear the weight. When officers insisted on order, lines stretched for miles, columns of blue or gray threading slowly across the countryside. Foraging became a grim necessity. Rations were inconsistent, often late or spoiled by the time they arrived. Soldiers stole chickens from farms, plucked apples from orchards, or slaughtered livestock when they could. Confederate soldiers, especially, suffered shortages due to the Union blockade. Cornmeal became their staple, supplemented by whatever could be found locally. Hunger was a constant companion, driving men to desperation. There are records of men boiling leather straps or chewing bark to quiet their stomachs. Letters carried the weight of hope. A soldier's correspondence might describe the smallest details: a bird spotted on a march, the sound of rain on a tent, the kindness of a stranger offering water. These details, though mundane, reassured families back home. Mothers and wives read them again and again, sometimes passing them to neighbors. For each scrap of news connected the distant war to the rhythms of daily life at home. But letters also bore sorrow. A man might confess his fears before a looming battle, or describe the burial of a friend. Paper became a vessel for grief. Some soldiers carried unfinished letters in their pockets during combat, hoping that if they fell, someone might deliver the words to their families. Officers, too, sometimes wrote to grieving households, explaining the circumstances of a death as best they could. Night in camp brought both stillness and unease. Fires glowed, casting shifting shadows against canvas walls. Some men told stories, others prayed quietly, while a few fell into silence, staring into the flames. Beyond the fires lay the dark woods, filled with unseen noises: the cry of an owl, the snap of a twig, the faint rustle of movement. Pickets stood guard through the night, knowing that an enemy raid could erupt without warning. Sleep came in, fragments often broken by dreams of home or the sudden call of alarm. Amid all of this, the presence of chaplains and sermons provided spiritual anchor. Soldiers gathered under trees or within tents to listen to scripture and hymn singing. Religion offered meaning in an environment where death was always near. Some men found new faith, others clung to old doubts, but nearly all considered mortality more closely than they ever had before. And yet, the rhythm of soldier life was not all despair. There were small joys: the arrival of mail, the distribution of fresh socks, the laughter of men playing cards. When bands played, men sang. When photographers visited, soldiers posed stiffly, wanting to send their images home. Life continued, not in grand moments, but in details. Through all this, the question lingered: how much of a soldier's existence was truly about fighting, and how much was about enduring the endless, quiet struggle of camp life? The battlefield would come soon enough. But in these long stretches of waiting, one truth became clear: war was not only about courage under fire, it was also about patience, resilience, and the dull strength required to survive one more day. And so, as soldiers settled into another night under canvas and stars, I could ask, in the shadow of a conflict that defined a nation, was the real battle perhaps fought not in clashes of armies, but in the slow wearing down of body and spirit through the daily grind of soldiering? Asterisk, by the time a soldier finally marched into battle, the months of routine had shaped him into something both familiar and unrecognizable. The endless drills, the tasteless meals, the long nights of scratching lice or shivering in damp wooldies were not just hardships, but conditioning. The ordinary farm boy who had once thought of war as flags and heroism had now been tempered into someone hardened by monotony, made ready, if reluctantly, for the violence to come. Yet, even as armies moved toward the sound of cannons, the daily life of the soldier continued. Battle was only a small fraction of a soldier's existence. Most days were still spent in waiting, marching, or working. Even on campaign, men spent more hours repairing roads, digging trenches, or standing guard than firing muskets. A soldier was as much a laborer as a fighter, and his war was waged as much against mud, hunger, and weariness as against the enemy across the field. When combat came, the contrast was staggering. Diaries often describe the first moments of battle as a kind of rupture, a sudden break in the rhythm of camp life. Muskets cracked, cannon thundered, smoke drifted thick across fields, and orders were drowned in noise. Soldiers wrote of their shock at the sight of friends falling beside them, the ground shaking beneath their feet, and the acrid taste of gunpowder filling their mouths. But even here, the habits of daily life guided them. Men fell back on their drills, loading and firing almost without thought. The very repetition that had seemed dull in camp now became survival. A man who had practiced until his fingers moved automatically could fire while his mind reeled in terror. In this way, the boring details of soldier life, the endless practice of motions, the heavy gear carried each day filled their grim purpose. After battle, the routines returned. Survivors gathered, counted the missing, and set about burying the dead. The work was grim and hurried. Wooden markers were erected when possible, but many graves went unmarked. Names lost in the churn of war. Soldiers scavenged from the fallen boots, blankets, and even cartridges, because supply shortages left no room for sentiment. Life had to go on, and the camp still needed to be fed, drilled, and ordered. Illness followed armies wherever they went. After long marches and bloody clashes, men often collapsed, not from wounds, but from fever. Hospitals overflowed with the sick, and surgeons worked with crude tools, often without anesthesia until ether or chloroform could be found. Amputations were common, carried out quickly to prevent infection. A soldier might survive battle only to perish days later from disease in a crowded ward. The cycle was unending. The psychological toll was equally heavy. Many men wrote of loneliness so deep it was difficult to put into words. They missed their homes, their families, the rhythm of farm life or trade. Some confessed to crying when they read letters from home, hiding their tears from comrades. Others grew numb, shutting out emotion as a way to cope. Words like weary, tired, and worn out appear again and again in their letters. Yet bonds between soldiers deepened in response to this weariness. Comrades became brothers. They shared jokes, guarded each other's sleep, and carried one another when feet bled raw. They celebrated the smallest victories: a letter, a clean shirt, a rare meal of fresh bread. These bonds often outlasted the war itself. Veterans would later recall the closeness of camp life with a strange nostalgia, remembering not only the hardship but the companionship that grew from it. For Confederate soldiers, shortages grew worse as the war dragged on. Union blockades starved the South of supplies, and uniforms grew tattered. Shoes wore out, and food became scarce. Some soldiers marched barefoot, their feet bleeding on frozen ground. Others fashioned makeshift clothing from homespun fabric, sent by families. Hunger gnawed constantly, and desertion rates rose. Yet, many continued, bound by loyalty, pride, or simple habit. Union soldiers faced their own burdens. Though better supplied, they endured longer campaigns and the strain of marching into hostile territory. Many Union soldiers struggled with the ambiguity of their purpose: fighting to preserve the Union, to end slavery, or simply because they had enlisted with friends. Their diaries show confusion alongside determination, reflecting the complexity of a war that reshaped the nation even as it consumed lives. Cultural life persisted, even amid the suffering. Soldiers read newspapers when they could, passing single copies from hand to hand until they fell apart. They attended. The Civil War is remembered for Gettysburg, Antietam, and Appomattox, for generals and speeches and turning points. But for the common soldier, the war was lived in countless smaller moments: scrubbing a rifle, stitching a tear in a shirt, writing to a loved one by candlelight. These were the real substance of soldier life, the threads that wove the vast tapestry of the conflict. And so, one must reflect: when we think of war, do we remember too much the thunder of battle, and too little the endless, wearying, quietly human routines that truly defined what it meant to be a soldier? Asterisk. When people imagine the American Civil War, they often picture soldiers in blue and gray, the battlefields, the drums, the smoke curling over lines of men. But the war's reach stretched far beyond the trenches and fields. Behind those armies stood women, millions of them whose lives were reshaped by the conflict. They were not always in uniform, but their daily work, quiet resilience, and hidden courage shaped the course of the war just as surely as rifles and cannons. You begin to imagine the world of 1861 through their eyes. Towns where men departed in groups, leaving farms, shops, and workshops half empty. Homes where fathers, brothers, and husbands were suddenly gone, replaced by silence and uncertainty. For women, the war was not fought with muskets, but with needles, nursing cloths, factory machines, and, in secret cases, coded letters and whispered intelligence. The war created a demand for labor, unlike anything the United States had seen before. Women, who had traditionally been confined to domestic roles, now found themselves thrust into positions that had been considered unsuitable or even impossible for them. The sudden absence of men meant that farms had to be tilled by women, shops had to be run by wives, and factories had to expand their workforce to include female laborers in northern states. Textile mills and munitions factories swelled with women. They worked long hours, often in dangerous conditions, stitching uniforms, rolling bandages, and packing cartridges. The steady thump of machinery replaced the rhythm of domestic life. So many, it was the first time they earned wages outside the home. Pay was low, often a fraction of what men received, but it was survival. Women's hands stitched the seams of countless uniforms and filled the boxes of bullets that be carried to the front. In the South, the blockade made shortages severe. Women became resourceful, spinning cloth at home when imported fabric, ran dry, or boiling plants to make homemade dyes. They melted pewter for bullets, scraped together salt for preserving food, and learned to stretch rations for families left behind. Some turned to barter, exchanging homemade soap or bread for other scarce necessities. The war blurred the boundary between household work and national struggle. Yet some women stepped even closer to the heart of the war, the battlefield hospitals. Nursing was not considered a respectable occupation for women before the Civil War. It was thought unseemly for a woman to care for strange men, to see wounds, or to face disease. But necessity broke tradition. From both North and South, women volunteered to tend the sick and wounded. The work was grueling. Hospitals were often little more than barns or tents, filled with rows of cots where soldiers lay groaning. The air reeked of blood, sweat, and infection. Women washed wounds, changed bandages, carried water, and spoon-fed those too weak to eat. Many contracted diseases themselves, falling ill from constant exposure. And yet, countless diaries record how soldiers took comfort in their presence, calling them angels for their compassion. Clara Barton became one of the most famous of these nurses. Known as the Angel of the Battlefield, she moved supplies directly to frontline hospitals, refusing to stay far from danger. She worked tirelessly, tending the wounded in some of the war's bloodiest battles. Later, she would go on to found the American Red Cross. But in those years, she was simply a woman who refused to turn away from suffering. Mary Ann Bickerdike was another figure remembered by Union soldiers. She organized field hospitals, insisted on sanitation, and fought military officers when they neglected the wounded. Soldiers nicknamed her mother Bickerdike. And her authority was so respected that even generals deferred to her. But beyond these famous names were thousands of anonymous women whose work sustained armies. Some were mothers searching for their sons among the wounded. Others were farm girls volunteering for the first time. And still others were widows who had nothing left to lose. Their presence in hospitals helped shift public opinion, making nursing a recognized and vital profession. Women's roles also extended into the dangerous world of espionage. Spies moved quietly through towns and camps, gathering intelligence under the cover of ordinary life. Women, often overlooked by men who underestimated them, carried messages in petticoats, hid supplies beneath baskets, and used coded language. In letters in the Confederacy, Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a Washington socialite, became famous for a network of spies who passed information to the South. Her coded messages are believed to have contributed to the Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run. Arrested by Union authorities, she remained defiant, even smuggling notes from her cell. On the Union side, Harriet Tubman, already renowned for her work with the Underground Railroad, took on roles as scout, nurse, and spy. She guided raids, provided intelligence on Confederate positions, and helped liberate hundreds of enslaved people during the war. Her knowledge of Southern terrain and networks proved invaluable. Women also disguised themselves as men to fight directly. Though rare, there are documented cases of women donning uniforms, cutting their hair short, and enlisting under false names. Some fought for months or years before being discovered, often only when wounded. Their motivations varied: patriotism, adventure, or the need to stay close to loved ones. But their presence reminds us how porous the boundaries of gender became under the strain of war. Life at home was equally demanding. With men gone, women managed farms and households, raised children, and bore the emotional burden of uncertainty. Letters from wives often reveal careful balance, sharing local news, expressing love, and concealing worries to avoid burdening soldiers with fears from home. Meanwhile, women waited anxiously for return letters, scanning casualty lists in newspapers and clinging to rumors. The war also forced women into public life in new ways. Fundraising fairs became popular in northern cities, where women organized events to raise money for soldiers' relief. These fairs showcased homemade goods, raffles, and performances, channeling domestic skills into national service. Women who had rarely spoken in public now addressed crowds, negotiated donations, and managed large operations. African American women faced unique struggles. Enslaved women in the South seized opportunities for escape as Union armies advanced, often bringing children with them. Some worked as laundresses, cooks, or nurses for Union troops, carving new lives out of upheaval. Others provided intelligence, guiding soldiers through local terrain or reporting Confederate movements. For free black women in the North, the war opened some new avenues of work and activism, though prejudice remained a constant obstacle. Taken together, the experiences of women in the Civil War reveal a world in flux. The rigid gender roles of the antebellum era bent under the weight of necessity. Women discovered strength in places society had denied them, and though many returned to traditional roles after the war, the memory of their contributions lingered. And so, one must pause and wonder, in a war remembered for generals and battles, do we overlook the quiet, unarmed army of women who held families, farms, and even armies together, whose labor and courage stitched the very fabric of the nation during its most divided years? Asterisk, the Civil War unfolded not only on battlefields, but also in kitchens, barns, workshops, and makeshift hospitals, where women shouldered responsibilities that had once been considered unimaginable. By 1862, as the war deepened and casualties mounted, the presence of women in roles of service and sacrifice became more visible. Their daily lives were reshaped into routines of labor, waiting, and worry, yet also of resilience and quiet defiance in the hospitals. Women endured sights that left lasting impressions on their memories. Rows of cots filled barns and churches, converted into wards. Windows, when present, were thrown open to let in air heavy with the iron temps of blood and the sourness of infection. Many nurses wrote about how the moans of the wounded became a kind of constant background noise, something one eventually noticed less, though never escaped entirely. Women washed wounds with water, often drawn from nearby rivers, changed bandages that clung to congealed blood, and learned to keep calm in the presence of suffering. Asterisk. The supplies at hand were rarely adequate. Women improvised, tearing cloth from their own dresses to use as bandages, or boiling sheets scavenged from nearby houses. Soap and clean water were treasures. The act of keeping wounds clean, though simple, was revolutionary at a time when medical science had not yet widely embraced germ theory. Some nurses intuitively emphasized sanitation, reducing infection rates even if they did not understand the microscopic causes. For soldiers, the presence of women in hospitals was profoundly humanizing. Let us describe the comfort of hearing a gentle voice, of being fed soup from a steady hand, or of simply being spoken to as more than a number in a ledger. One Union soldier wrote that a nurse's kind words were worth more than medicine. For the dying, women often became surrogate family, holding hands and whispering prayers when loved ones could not be present beyond the hospital walls. Women in towns and countryside endured different but equally heavy burdens. With so many men away, farms became women's responsibility. In the north, wives guided plows across fields, milked cows, and hauled firewood, while also managing children and household duties. In the south, where shortages were worse, women sometimes faced near starvation, trading whatever they could: quilts, eggs, even family heirlooms for flour or salt. Diaries and letters from these women show remarkable detail about daily survival. Some recorded the careful management of food, stretching cornmeal with sweet potatoes or rendering fat into candles. Others noted the endless worry over whether crops would be stolen by passing troops, whether Union soldiers confiscating supplies or Confederate soldiers requisitioning them for the cause. The war was not distant, it passed through their doorsteps, taking what little stability remained. In the cities, women found themselves in factories at unprecedented rates. The need for uniforms, tents, and ammunition meant industrial work expanded rapidly. Women stitched endless seams, sometimes in workshops with poor light and stifling air, earning wages that barely sustained them. Others worked in arsenals, rolling cartridges and filling shells, a task fraught with danger. Explosions were not uncommon. In 1864, an explosion at the Washington Arsenal killed more than 20 young women who had been packing cartridges. Newspapers mourned them as martyrs to the Union cause. Some women's war work remained hidden, slipping beneath the notice of official records. Spies, couriers, and informants risked lives in silence. Rose O'Neal Greenhouse Network in Washington may have been famous, but she was not alone. Ordinary women in both North and South passed notes concealed in hair, hymns, and baskets. Some feigned innocence when questioned. Others relied on the blindness of men who could not imagine women engaging in serious espionage. These quiet acts carried information that shifted battles, though the names of many such women were lost to history. African American women, both enslaved and free, contributed in ways even less often recorded. Enslaved women working on southern plantations acted as informants, relaying Confederate troop movements to Union soldiers when opportunities arose. Others risked everything to flee with their children, seeking refuge behind Union lines. Once there, many worked as laundresses, cooks, or nurses for the armies, exchanging labor for freedom and safety. Harriet Tubman's work as a Union scout and spy was only the most visible tip of a much larger reality: black women using knowledge of land and people to undermine the Confederacy. In the border states, where loyalties were divided, women navigated especially precarious situations. A wife might support the Union while her husband secretly aided Confederate guerrillas. Families split along partisan lines, with women forced to conceal opinions, hide supplies, or feign neutrality to avoid suspicion. Their letters revealed constant tension. Every choice weighed for the risk it carried. Relief work also drew women into public life in ways that had once been rare. The United States Sanitary Commission, founded to support Union soldiers, relied heavily on women's volunteer labor. They sewed bandages, collected blankets, and organized sanitary fairs to raise funds. These fairs became major civic events, with women managing stalls, raffles, and exhibitions that drew thousands. Through such work, women demonstrated organizational abilities and leadership that challenged earlier assumptions about their proper place in society. In the Confederacy, similar efforts unfolded through local aid societies. Women gathered in churches to prepare care packages, rolling bandages, knitting socks, and baking bread for soldiers. These tasks, while rooted in domestic skills, became deeply political. A pair of knitted socks could symbolize loyalty to the Confederate cause, while a jar of preserves represented sacrifice. The boundary between household labor and national service blurred entirely. The emotional landscape for women was perhaps the most difficult to capture. Waiting for letters that might never come, scanning newspapers for casualty lists, and enduring rumors of battles, all this weighed heavily. Mothers, wives, and daughters lived in states of suspended grief, unsure whether loved ones were alive. Some wrote of the dread that accompanied each knock at the door, fearing it might be news of death. Women also bore the strain of mourning without closure. The vast scale of Civil War death meant many bodies would never recovered, leaving families with only absence. Some women wore mourning black for years. Others clung to letters as the last tangible connection. Communities became marked by widows and fatherless children, reshaping the social fabric long after the war ended. At the same time, war created moments of empowerment. Some women found pride in their ability to sustain households, manage farms, and contribute to national causes. For many, these experiences altered their sense of what women could do, though much of society expected them to return to traditional roles after the war. The memory of their expanded capabilities lingered, laying quiet groundwork for future movements toward women's rights. The Civil War, then, was not only a story of armies and generals, but also a story of women carrying burdens previously unseen. Their work was not glamorous, often not even recognized, but it was essential. And so, one might pause to ask, in the long shadow of the war, was the true strength of the nation not also measured in the quiet determination of women rolling bandages, plowing fields, waiting for news whose endurance held families and communities together through years of uncertainty? Asterisk. By the midpoint of the war in 1863, the presence of women in roles far beyond the domestic sphere had become impossible to ignore. What began as an emergency response, filling in while men marched away, was now the new normal. Whether they labored in hospitals, factories, fields, or in the shadows as spies, women had carved out spaces in the war effort that neither government nor army could function without. The hospitals had grown larger and more organized, yet the work remained relentless. Women who had once entered those wards hesitantly now became seasoned nurses, confident in their routines. They learned how to prioritize cases when supplies were short, how to comfort men who could not be saved, and how to persuade skeptical doctors to adopt practices of cleanliness and order. These skills, acquired in crisis, would later echo into the professionalization of nursing as a respected career. Clara Barton continued her tireless work, distributing supplies and tending to the wounded even during active battles. She was known to move calmly among cannon fire, carrying water and bandages, her presence steadying soldiers' nerves. Women like Barton embodied a shift in public perception. No longer were they seen as merely out of place on the battlefield. They were recognized as indispensable. Meanwhile, espionage continued to blur the boundaries of traditional gender roles. Rose O'Neal Greenhow remained a symbol of Confederate defiance, though she eventually drowned in 1864 when her boat overturned, her pockets weighed down by gold meant for the Confederacy. Her story illustrates both the reach and the risks of women's clandestine work. On the Union side, Elizabeth Van Loo of Richmond operated a vast spy ring, including enslaved workers who passed information to her. Her reports reached Union generals and influenced strategy. These networks remind us that behind the visible movements of armies were the invisible actions of women gathering, hiding, and transmitting knowledge. Asterisk, but the most enduring contributions of women may have been in the rhythms of daily survival. A woman on a southern farm, watching her children while plowing fields, may not have considered herself part of the grand narrative of war, yet her work kept families alive. A northern seamstress stitching uniforms by lamplight may have thought her work dull, but each seemed clothed a soldier. These details, quiet, repetitive, often boring, were the true fabric of the war. Asterisk. The strains of war also brought women into the realm of protest. In 1863, food riots erupted in Richmond and other southern cities, led largely by women desperate to feed their families. They stormed bakeries and warehouses, demanding bread at affordable prices. Confederate officials were shocked, for these demonstrations revealed the desperation on the home front. The image of women traditionally cast as symbols of patience and sacrifice, taking to the streets in anger, disrupted the narrative of quiet endurance. At the same time, women were reshaping communities through relief work. In northern cities, sanitary fairs grew into massive events, blending charity with civic pride. Women planned exhibits, sold handmade goods, and even displayed wartime relics. These fairs raised millions of dollars for the Union cause, but more importantly, they placed women in positions of authority over large-scale public projects. For many participants, this was their first experience in organizing beyond the household, and it left a lasting impression. For African American women, the war years brought profound, if uneven, changes. Enslaved women who escaped often found freedom precarious, dependent on the protection of Union armies. Some settled in contraband camps that sprang up near military lines, where life was harsh but liberty was possible. Others took employment with Union regiments, cooking, laundering, and nursing. Harriet Tubman's leadership in a raid along the Combahee River in 1863, which freed more than 700 enslaved people, stands as a reminder of the extraordinary ways in which women shaped emancipation on the ground. Free black women in the North engaged in activism through churches, aid societies, and abolitionist networks. They raised funds, provided supplies, and advocated for the rights of black soldiers. Yet, racism constrained recognition of their work, leaving many of their names unrecorded in official histories. Their contributions, though obscured, were vital to both the war effort and the broader struggle for equality. By the closing years of the war, the cumulative weight of women's labor had become clear. Soldiers wrote in their diaries about the socks knitted by anonymous hands, the letters written by mothers and wives, the bandages applied by nurses, and the meals served in camps. These small gestures, multiplied across millions of women, sustained armies and lifted spirits. The return of peace in 1865 brought both relief and unease. Many women were expected to relinquish their wartime roles and return to traditional domesticity. Some did so willingly, weary of years of labor and longing for stability. Others found the transition difficult, having discovered capabilities and independence they could not easily forget. The Civil War had opened doors, even if only temporarily, and the memory of what women had achieved lingered in households and communities. The professionalization of nursing, the expansion of women's civic participation, and the seeds of the women's rights movement were all watered, in part, by the experiences of these years. While not all women embraced new public roles, the war had proved beyond doubt that women could endure, organize, and lead under the heaviest burdens. The image of women in the Civil War is often framed in terms of angels of mercy, quiet supporters. Yet, their reality was far more complex. They were laborers, leaders, spies, rebels, and mourners. They embodied patience, but also defiance. They stitched and nursed, but they also plotted and protested. And so, when reflecting on the Civil War, one might ask, is the truest legacy of women in that era not simply what they did during those years, but how their efforts quietly reshaped expectations of what women could be in the decades to come? When the American Civil War began in 1861, the first surge of volunteers emptied towns and farms across the divided nation. Men marched off with rifles, uniforms, and promises of glory, leaving behind wives, children, parents, and communities to adjust to a new reality. The battlefield may have decided the war's great turning points, But life on the home front determined how long families could endure, and whether a fractured country could sustain itself through 4 long years of struggle. You can picture the quiet changes first. A plow standing still in a field where a farmer had once guided it each morning. A shop with its shutters closed because the owner had joined a regiment. A household suddenly without its father or eldest son, the tasks of daily survival falling to those who remained. The war came to the home front, not in the thunder of cannons, but in absence, silence, and 1,000 small adjustments for many families. The farm was the first test. In the North, farms were expected to continue producing grain, livestock, and dairy for both civilian life and the growing needs of the army. With men gone, women, children, and older relatives stepped into roles that had been considered beyond their strength. Daughters yoked themselves to plows, mothers took charge of sowing and harvesting, and young boys drove wagons heavy with hay or corn. The rhythm of agricultural life did not pause for war. If anything, it became more demanding, with the added strain of uncertainty about whether husbands and sons would ever return in the South. The blockade imposed by Union naval forces magnified the hardship. Cotton, once the proud cash crop of the Confederacy, became nearly useless without the ability to sell it abroad. Fields that had been devoted to cotton brought no immediate sustenance, and food shortages quickly grew. Planters, unwilling or unable to shift production to food, often left communities vulnerable to hunger. Women and enslaved workers shouldered the burden of improvising planting gardens, raising chickens, and bartering for cornmeal or flour. Rationing became an unspoken law of life. In the North, families endured fluctuations in food prices as the war economy drove inflation. In the South, scarcity became dire. Coffee vanished first, replaced with bitter substitutes made from roasted acorns, chicory, or sweet potatoes. Salt, essential for preserving meat, grew precious. Families scraped salt from the floors of smokehouses or boiled seawater when possible. Meat was stretched thin, vegetables preserved carefully, and bread became smaller, harder, more precious. Women's diaries often revealed the details of this new economy of survival. A Confederate woman might record with bitterness the meal of cornbread and sorghum syrup served day after day, while a Northern woman might note the long hours sewing uniforms for pay to buy butter for her children. These records, mundane in their details, remind us that wars are fought not only by armies, but by households balancing ledgers, stretching rations, and keeping fires lit through cold winters. Children also bore the changes. With fathers gone, many became laborers in fields or workshops long before their time. Others faced the emotional burden of watching mothers struggle with loneliness and worry. Some children collected scrap metal, old rags, or even bones, which could be sold or repurposed for the war effort. The language of play shifted to wooden guns, toy drums. Games of soldiers reflected the reality that the war surrounded them, even if they were far from battlefields. In towns and cities, the home front carried its own rhythms. Shops adjusted to shortages by raising prices or offering substitute goods. Markets bustled with barter as cash lost value. In both North and South, paper money replaced coinage, but inflation reduced its worth rapidly. Housewives became skilled negotiators, learning which shopkeepers would extend credit and which demanded payment in kind. A pair of hand-knit socks or a jar of homemade preserves might serve as currency as real as dollars. The emotional strain weighed constantly. Letters were the lifeline between home and battlefield, but they traveled slowly, sometimes taking weeks or months. A woman might receive 3 letters at once after weeks of silence, or none at all. Rumors of battles passed from neighbor to neighbor, carried by newspapers that printed lists of casualties. Families scanned those names with dread, bracing themselves for recognition. Silence itself could become unbearable. Leaving loved ones unsure whether absence meant survival or death. Religious communities offered some solace. Churches became centers not only of worship, but also of mutual aid. Women gathered to sew bandages, knit socks, and pack boxes. In the North, immigration added another layer to the home front. Irish and German families, many newly arrived, found themselves navigating loyalty, poverty, and prejudice, while also contributing labor to factories and farms. Draft laws in 1863 provoked anger among working-class families who felt the burden of war fell unfairly on them, while wealthier men could pay for substitutes. The infamous New York City draft riots revealed how tensions on the home front could explode into violence. Through all of this, daily life was marked by small acts of adaptation. Families learned to mend clothing again and again, turning coats inside out, stitching patches on patches. Shoes were resoled, sometimes with wood or cloth. Candles were stretched thin by trimming wicks carefully. Gardens sprouted in backyards. Every available space turned to food production. These quiet details, boring in their repetition, were what allowed families to survive. And yet, the home front was not only a place of deprivation, it was also a place of memory and longing. Women preserved letters tied with ribbon, rereading them by lamplight. Children traced the outlines of fathers' faces in faded photographs. Families told stories at night, reminding one another of absent loved ones. These rituals of remembering sustained morale in ways that no ration or coin could. The war's outcome depended as much on this endurance as on military victories. Without farms continuing to yield crops, factories to churn out goods, and households to raise children, the armies themselves would have collapsed. The home front was the quiet engine of the war, grinding forward through boredom, hardship, and grief. And so one wonders, when historians count battles and generals, do they overlook the millions of kitchens, barns, and marketplaces where this war was lived every day, not in glory, but in patience and persistence? Asterisk. By the second year of the war, the quiet endurance of the home front had hardened into routine. What at first felt like temporary adjustments, patching clothes, bartering for food, tending fields without fathers or sons, became the steady rhythm of survival. In countless towns across the North and South, the war had settled into kitchens, workshops, and marketplaces, shaping daily life in ways that would leave permanent marks. The farms carried the heaviest weight. Northern fields, though better supplied, still demanded labor far beyond what women and children had previously borne. Letters from wives described the strain of harvesting wheat alone, of rising before dawn to milk cows, chop wood, and plow acres with only the help of neighbors or young sons. Women learned to harness mules, mend harness straps, and drive wagons, their hands calloused by tools once managed by absent men. In some communities, women organized cooperative labor, gathering in groups to thresh wheat or husk corn, helping one another finish tasks too great for one household alone. In the Confederacy, the burden was multiplied by scarcity. Union blockades choked the flow of imported goods, leaving Southern households to improvise. Everyday items became symbols of resilience and frustration. Coffee disappeared, replaced with bitter acorn brews. Fabric was scarce. Women unraveled old clothing to weave new garments. Cane, precious for preserving meat, became a treasure. Families scraped it from the floors of smokehouses or boiled down brine from salt licks. Diaries often recorded these substitutions, not as novelty, but as weary necessity. "We drink acorn coffee," one woman wrote in 1863, "and pretend it is enough." Children carried more responsibility than ever before. A boy of 12 might plow fields from sunrise to sunset, while his sister churned butter, tended chickens, and cared for younger siblings. Children also joined in collecting scraps for the war effort, told iron to be melted into weapons. Rags to be processed into paper, even bones used in various industries. These tasks, small in themselves, instilled in children a constant awareness that their lives were bent toward war. In towns and cities, shortages transformed economies. Merchants raised prices, often daily, while families turned increasingly to barter. A jar of honey might be exchanged for flour, a pair of hand-knit mittens for candles. In the South, inflation ran wild. Confederate currency lost value so quickly that women sometimes carried baskets of bills to market, only to find that prices had doubled overnight. In Richmond, a single barrel of flour could cost hundreds of Confederate dollars. Survival demanded ingenuity, but it also bred anger. As poorer families found themselves unable to keep pace, this frustration boiled over in food riots. The most famous occurred in Richmond in April 1863, when hundreds of women, many wives of soldiers, mothers of children, desperate from hunger, stormed through the streets demanding bread. They smashed shop windows, seized food, and shouted slogans against the government that had failed them. Confederate President Jefferson Davis himself confronted the crowd, urging them to disperse, but the riots revealed that even loyalty to the cause could not erase hunger. Smaller protests echoed across southern towns, each one a reminder that the home front's endurance had limits. In the North, where shortages were less severe, women still shouldered endless labor. Sewing circles met weekly in churches or town halls, stitching uniforms, knitting socks, and rolling bandages. Fundraising fairs, organized largely by women, became grand civic events. These sanitary fairs raised millions of dollars for the Union's Sanitary Commission, which provided medical supplies to soldiers. Beyond money, they created new spaces where women took leadership roles, organizing stalls, negotiating donations, and addressing crowds for women who had never spoken publicly before. This was both a necessity and a revelation of possibility. Religion remained central to morale. Ministers framed sacrifice at home as equal to sacrifice on the battlefield, encouraging women to view rationing, sewing, and waiting as holy duties. Prayer meetings offered comfort, while hymns gave voice to grief. Communities gathered not only to worship, but to support one another, sharing food, childcare, and news. In many places, the church became the emotional anchor of the home front. African American families, both enslaved and free, navigated the war with unique challenges. For enslaved women, the absence of enslavers or overseers, many of whom had gone to fight, sometimes brought greater responsibility, but also opportunities for resistance. Some slowed work, feigned illness, or refused tasks. Others seized chances to flee with children, heading toward Union lines where freedom was uncertain but possible. Contraband camps grew near Union armies, filled with families who had risked everything to leave plantations. Life in these camps was harsh, but women worked as laundresses, cooks, and nurses, carving new roles in a shifting world. Free black women in the North contributed to the war effort through churches, aid societies, and abolitionist networks. They sewed clothing for black regiments, raised funds for schools, and supported families of soldiers. Yet racism often excluded them from white-led organizations, forcing them to build parallel structures of relief. Their work, though less recognized in official records, was essential to sustaining both soldiers and communities. The emotional strain on the home front was constant. Families lived in cycles of waiting for letters, waiting for news of battles, waiting for loved ones to return. Newspapers printed lists of the dead and wounded, names arranged in stark columns that households scanned with trembling hands. A knock at the door might bring relief for devastation. Letters themselves were both lifelines and burdens. They carried news, affection, and encouragement, but also silence, omissions, or confessions of fear that left loved ones anxious. Some women wrote of the weight of uncertainty as worse than grief itself. To know a husband or son had died was crushing, but to wait endlessly for news that might never come frayed nerves beyond repair. Communities became marked by mourning. Women dressed in black, children carried tokens of remembrance, and funerals often took place without bodies, as so many soldiers lay in distant graves. And yet, life persisted. Gardens were planted each spring, harvests brought in each fall. Children grew, birthdays passed, and households found ways to mark holidays even with meager resources. Christmas trees were decorated with homemade ornaments. Thanksgiving meals stretched with whatever ingredients could be found. These rituals carried hope, reminders that normal life was not entirely erased, only reshaped. The resilience of the home front was perhaps most visible in its quiet adaptations. A family learning to dye homespun cloth with walnut shells, a mother teaching her daughter to bake bread with limited flour, neighbors sharing tools when iron was scarce. These details, small and unglamorous, formed the real substance of endurance. And so, one might ask, when wars are remembered for battles and treaties, do we forget that their outcome often rests on these invisible choices made in kitchens, fields, and markets, choices that kept families alive long enough for armies to keep fighting? By 1864, the war had stretched into its fourth year. The optimism that had filled parades in 1861 was long gone, replaced by a heavy weariness that settled over farms, towns, and cities. On the home front, survival had become less about novelty, substitutions, or patriotic enthusiasm, and more about sheer endurance. Families no longer asked how long the war would last. They simply asked whether they could last long enough to see it end. The farms bore witness to this fatigue. In the North, agricultural production remained high, but at great human cost. Women worked fields season after season, shoulders bent to plows, hands blistered from harvest tools. Older children, hardened by necessity, became accustomed to tasks once thought beyond their years. In many households, the absence of men became a constant backdrop rather than a temporary disruption. Entire communities learned to function with new definitions of family labor. In the Confederacy, scarcity reached crisis levels. The Union blockade tightened, railroads deteriorated, and armies requisitioned supplies directly from civilians. Hunger became widespread, particularly in cities where access to farms was limited. Diaries speak of meals consisting of little more than cornbread and molasses, day after day. Some families boiled weeds or made soups of dried peas stretched with water. Salt, sugar, and coffee had become luxuries far beyond reach. In this context, ingenuity was not a choice, but survival. Women became the managers of this survival economy. They stitched and restitched clothing until garments were little more than layers of patches. They rendered soap from lye and fat, boiled herbs for medicine, and bartered tirelessly at markets where goods grew scarcer and prices rose daily. Their diaries reveal a mixture of pride and resourcefulness and exhaustion from unending labor. "We do not live as before," one Southern woman wrote. "We only endure." The burden of waiting grew heavier with each passing month. Letters, when they arrived, were treasures. When they did not, silence became unbearable. Newspapers printed longer and longer lists of casualties, columns of names that seemed endless. Families scanned them with dread, sometimes finding a loved one's name, sometimes not knowing whether absence meant safety or death. Mourning became woven into the fabric of daily life. Women wore black for years. Children grew up fatherless, and households adjusted to permanent loss even before the war was officially over. Communities changed in invisible ways. In towns, widows became more common, their presence marking the war's toll as clearly as battlefield reports. Orphans increased, cared for by extended families or by charitable institutions stretched thin. Churches filled with congregations, heavy with grief, yet also served as centers of resilience where sewing circles still met, hymns still rose, and neighbors still supported one another with shared food and labor. Economic life, too, bore scars. In the South, inflation reached staggering levels. Confederate dollars became almost worthless. Some families resorted entirely to barter, exchanging eggs for cloth or candles for flour. In the North, inflation was steadier, but still significant, especially for working-class families. Draft laws provoked resentment, especially when wealthier men could pay for substitutes, while poorer families saw sons conscripted. The New York City draft riots in 1863 had already revealed how home front frustrations could erupt into violence. But even after the riots subsided, tensions lingered in neighborhoods where loss and poverty weighed most heavily African American. Families experienced the home front in profoundly different ways. For enslaved people in the Confederacy, the war years brought both intensified hardship and opportunities for liberation. Some plantations saw women left to manage both farm labor and households as enslavers joined the Confederate ranks. Others became sites of quiet resistance, with enslaved women slowing production, withholding labor, or aiding Union troops when possible. Escape became a defining act, with women leading children across dangerous terrain toward Union lines. Those who reached contraband camps found conditions, harsh disease, overcrowding, and scarcity were common, but they also found freedom in the chance to build new lives. Free black women in the North contributed to the Union cause by supporting soldiers, organizing relief through churches, and raising funds. They faced prejudice even in this work, often excluded from white-led organizations, yet they persisted. Some became educators in schools for freed people, traveling south to teach newly emancipated communities. Their efforts reflected both the burdens of the war and the beginnings of broader change. Despite hardship, rituals of normalcy persisted. Families still celebrated holidays, even if meals were meager. Thanksgiving dinners might feature little more than bread and potatoes, but they were marked with prayer and remembrance. Christmas trees were decorated with homemade ornaments crafted from paper, cloth, or even scraps of tin. Birthdays were remembered, marriages celebrated, and babies born into households already stretched thin. These rituals were acts of defiance against despair, reminders that life continued. The mental and emotional toll of the home front cannot be overstated. Women's letters reveal exhaustion, loneliness, and grief, yet also determination. They wrote of rising each day to face chores, even when strength seemed gone. They wrote of comforting children while suppressing their own fears. They wrote of faith, of endurance, of the stubborn will to survive. In these words, the war becomes not only a clash of armies, but a slow, grinding test of human spirit. By the time the war ended in 1865, the home front had been transformed. Families emerged, smaller, poorer, and marked by loss. Yet they also emerged with new skills, new roles, and new understandings of what survival demanded. Women who had managed farms and businesses carried those experiences into peacetime. Children who had labored beyond their years carried the memory of resilience into adulthood. Communities rebuilt slowly, with scars visible in the number of widows, the absence of sons, and the fragile stability of economies. Historians often recount the Civil War through battles, generals, and political decisions. Beneath those narratives lies another, the quiet war of kitchens, gardens, fields, and marketplaces. The war of rationing, of stretching meals, of mending clothing until nothing was left to patch. The war of letters sent and received, of waiting at windows for news, of mourning without bodies to bury. This was the war of the home front, a war of endurance rather than strategy, but no less decisive. And so, one must ask, when we measure the cost of war, do we weigh heavily enough the unseen sacrifices of those who fought not with rifles, but with patience, persistence, in the daily struggle to keep families alive? Asterisk, when the Civil War began in 1861, the United States had no military medical system prepared for the scale of suffering to come. Medicine at the time was still rooted in practices little changed from earlier centuries. Surgeons carried small kits of tools, doctors had limited training, and hospitals were often improvised from barns, churches, or tents. Into this environment marched millions of men, and within months, the war revealed a grim truth. The real enemy was not only the musket or the cannon, but disease, infection, and inadequate care. You can picture the early war hospitals' rows of rough wooden cots, soldiers lying in uniforms, stiff with blood, the air heavy with the stench of sweat, smoke, and sickness. Surgeons worked with bare hands, often moving from one patient to another without washing. Instruments were reused again and again, wiped on aprons already soaked with gore. Amputations were carried out quickly, not because of cruelty, but because speed was the only defense against shock and bleeding. The numbers were staggering. Of the roughly 620,000 deaths during the war, two-thirds came from disease rather than battle wounds. Dysentery, typhoid, fever, pneumonia, and malaria swept through camps and hospitals, killing silently while battles raged elsewhere. The crowded conditions of army life, combined with poor sanitation and limited understanding of germs, created breeding grounds for illness. A soldier was far more likely to die from contaminated water or spoiled food than from an enemy bullet. Surgeons, at the time, often learned their craft not through years of specialized study, but through apprenticeships and short medical courses. Few had experience with large-scale trauma. The war became their education. Letters and diaries describe young doctors scarcely older than the soldiers they treated, performing amputations for the first time under fire. Their tools, bone saws, scalpels, forceps, were simple, but they became the instruments of survival. Asterisk. Amputation was one of the most common procedures. A musket ball, irregular in shape and often carrying dirt or cloth into the wound, shattered bones beyond repair. Rather than attempt to save a limb, which almost always led to infection and death, surgeons cut quickly above the wound. Amputations were performed in minutes, sometimes in a similar fashion after battles. Soldiers who survived the shock faced long recoveries, with crude wooden crutches or prosthetics awaiting them. Many lived the rest of their lives, marked visibly by the war. Anesthesia existed, though not universally. Ether and chloroform were known and used when available. Shortages meant many operations were performed with little more than alcohol or physical restraint. Soldiers bit down on leather straps or wooden sticks, their cries echoing through crowded wards. Accounts from the time describe the haunting sound of saws against bone, the grim endurance of men who had no other choice. Yet, amid the horror, progress slowly emerged. The sheer scale of the conflict forced changes in organization and care. Field hospitals were set up closer to battle lines, evacuation systems improved, and surgeons gained experience rapidly. The Union Army, in particular, developed an ambulance corps to transport wounded soldiers, an innovation that saved countless lives. Triage, though not formally named, became a practice. Doctors learned to prioritize those who could be saved over those beyond help. Nurses played a vital role in this transformation. Women like Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix brought supplies, discipline, and compassion into chaotic wards. Under Dix's leadership, the Union recruited women to serve as nurses, breaking down social barriers that had once kept them from such work. They washed wounds, distributed food, wrote letters for the dying, and enforced basic cleanliness. Their presence improved morale as much as survival rates. On the Confederate side, resources were scarcer, but ingenuity abounded. Southern doctors improvised medicines from local plants, substituting when standard drugs were unavailable. Women on plantations and in towns prepared poultices, brewed teas, created home remedies that found their way into hospitals. While the South lacked the industrial capacity of the North, it developed a culture of adaptation that kept its medical system functioning despite shortages. Disease control remained the greatest challenge. Camps often lacked proper latrines, and soldiers drank from contaminated streams. Typhoid and dysentery spread relentlessly. Surgeons and officers slowly came to understand the importance of sanitation, even without knowledge of bacteria. Some camps introduced regulations for digging latrines far from water sources, boiling drinking water, and enforcing cleanliness. These measures, though inconsistently applied, marked small steps toward modern public health practices. The war also accelerated the use of new technologies. The telegraph and railroads allowed for faster communication and transport, including the movement of medical supplies. Railcars were adapted into hospital cars, carrying wounded soldiers to larger facilities in cities. Photography, still a relatively new art, captured images of hospitals, surgeons, and patients, shaping public awareness of the realities of war. Medicine. For the wounded, recovery was often long and uncertain. Prosthetic limbs became more common as thousands of men returned home without arms or legs. The U.S. government eventually established programs to provide artificial limbs to veterans, an early form of disability support. Communities, too, adapted, learning to accommodate the visible reminders of war carried by their neighbors. Yet, the emotional scars of Civil War medicine were perhaps deeper than the physical ones. Soldiers wrote about the terror of hearing screams from the operating tent, the dread of infection setting in, the loneliness of lying in a crowded ward without family nearby. Nurses recorded the heavy silence of death, the endless task of writing letters to families explaining how a son or a husband had passed. For many, the war introduced them to a scale of suffering they had never imagined. And so, the story of Civil War medicine is not simply one of crude tools and desperate measures. It is also a story of adaptation, of systems learning under pressure, of individuals discovering resilience amid horror. The war forced the United States to confront the inadequacies of its medical knowledge, and though progress was uneven, it laid groundwork for future reforms. But it leaves us with a question. When we remember the Civil War for its generals and battles, do we also remember the surgeons with bone saws, the nurses boiling water, the families mourning far from hospitals, those who struggled against disease and injury was as decisive as any clash of armies? Asterisk, by the middle years of the Civil War, 1862 and 1863, the inadequacies of early medical care had become impossible to ignore. The war's first battles, Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, Shiloh, produced casualties on a scale the nation had never seen before. Its towns near battlefields filled with makeshift hospitals, barns, and churches overflowing with the wounded. What began as chaos slowly transformed into systems of care, but only through grim necessity and countless failures. The sheer numbers, forced change. At Shiloh in 1862, more than 23,000 men were killed or wounded over 2 days. Surgeons, overwhelmed, worked without sleep, amputating limbs in endless succession. The ground outside hospitals piled with severed arms and legs, grim monuments to the scale of suffering for many civilians. Encountering this reality for the first time, the shock was profound. Farmers and townspeople opened their homes to house soldiers. Our kitchens and parlors turned into operating rooms. Organization grew in response. The Union Army created medical departments with clearer hierarchies, established ambulance corps for faster evacuation, and improved supply chains for medicines and instruments. Jonathan Letterman, the Union's medical director, revolutionized battlefield medicine by introducing standardized triage and coordinated evacuation. His system divided casualties into categories: those who could return quickly to duty, those needing immediate surgery, and those beyond saving. These principles, though simple, became foundations of modern emergency medicine. On the Confederate side, shortages made reform more difficult. Southern surgeons often lacked chloroform, bandages, or even basic instruments. They reused sutures, boiled cloth to make dressings, and crafted splints from wood scavenged near battlefields. Yet, ingenuity flourished. Plant-based remedies were rediscovered, and communities donated supplies when governments could not provide. Confederate doctors became adept at improvisation, though the limits of their resources meant mortality rates were often higher than in the North. Disease remained the deadliest foe. Camp spread dysentery, typhoid fever, and malaria, which spread faster than bullets. Soldiers drank from stagnant pools. Latrines were dug too close to water sources, and spoiled meat poisoned entire regiments. Surgeons increasingly recognized the link between filth and illness, even without understanding bacteria. Some camps imposed stricter sanitation rules, requiring latrines at set distances, designated garbage pits, and regular washing. These measures, unevenly enforced, saved lives where adopted. Nutrition was another overlooked factor. Poor diets weakened soldiers, leaving them more vulnerable to disease. In the South, blockades meant shortages of fresh vegetables, causing scurvy from lack of vitamin C. Northern soldiers fared better, but still complained of monotonous rations, salted meat, hardtack, and coffee. Surgeons occasionally recommended fresh food, but supply chains rarely allowed it. Malnourished soldiers recovered slowly from wounds, their bodies unable to fight infection. The hospitals themselves evolved. Early in the war, they were chaotic and unsanitary, with patients crammed together on straw or rough cots. By 1863, larger, purpose-built hospitals appeared in cities like Washington, Philadelphia, and Richmond. These facilities featured better ventilation, separate wards, and more systematic care. They could hold thousands of patients, resembling small towns with kitchens, laundries, and chapels. For many soldiers, these hospitals became their world. For months, places where time stretched slowly between pain, treatment, and uncertain recovery. Nursing, too, developed into something more structured. Dorothea Dix, appointed superintendent of Army nurses for the Union, established rules for recruiting women. They had to be over 30, plain in appearance, and serious in character. Though her standards excluded many younger volunteers, they reflected anxieties about propriety and discipline. In practice, however, countless women of all ages served, bringing compassion and resilience into hospitals. They boiled water, distributed meals, and sat with the dying. Soldiers often remembered them with deep gratitude, describing them as the difference between despair and hope. Asterisk. Among the most famous nurses was Clara Barton, whose work on the battlefield earned her a reputation as the angel of the battlefield. Unlike many nurses, she insisted on bringing supplies directly to the front lines, often under fire. The soldiers wrote that her presence steadied them amid chaos. After the war, her experiences would lead her to establish the American Red Cross. But during the conflict, she was one of countless women whose work blurred the line between civilian and military. On the Confederate side, women like Sally Tompkins became legends. Tompkins ran a private hospital in Richmond so efficiently that Confederate President Jefferson Davis gave her an official commission, the only woman to receive such rank. Her hospital's mortality rate was among the lowest in the South, testament to her strict emphasis on cleanliness and order. The war also highlighted the need for psychological care. Though the concept barely existed at the time, soldiers who survived battles sometimes displayed what we would now call post-traumatic stress nightmares. Trembling, emotional withdrawal, but doctors had little understanding. They spoke vaguely of soldiers' heart or nostalgia. On the home front, families struggled to understand why men returned, withdrawn, or changed. Civil War medicine saved bodies, but left minds largely unattended. The role of anesthesia is often misunderstood. Contrary to popular myth, most Civil War surgeries were not performed without it. Chloroform and ether were widely used by Union surgeons and, when available, by Confederate surgeons as well. Statistics suggest that more than 90% of operations employed anesthesia. Still, shortages and battlefield emergencies meant some soldiers endured surgery with only alcohol or leather to bite. The memory of these rare but terrible experiences shaped the public's imagination. The scale of amputations shocked the nation, but it also drove innovation. Prosthetic limb makers flourished after the war, designing new devices to meet demand. Governments provided subsidies for artificial limbs, recognizing their importance for veterans returning to civilian life. These developments marked early steps in disability support, though many amputees continue to struggle with pain, limited mobility, and social stigma. Beyond the immediate medical practices, the Civil War spurred broader reforms. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, created in 1861, became a model for public health. Staffed largely by civilians, including many women, it inspected camps, distributed supplies, and promoted hygiene. Its reports highlighted the deadly impact of poor sanitation, pushing military leaders to adopt reforms. The commission represented one of the first large-scale collaborations between government and civilian health organizations in American history. For soldiers, the daily reality of medicine was a mixture of dread and relief. They feared the surgeon's tent, knowing that entering often meant losing a limb. Yet, they also clung to hope in the hands of nurses and doctors who, despite limitations, worked tirelessly. Recovery was slow, marked by endless boredom, pain, and longing for home. Letters from hospitals speak of counting cracks in ceilings, memorizing the sounds of footsteps in corridors, and waiting endlessly for news. By the end of 1863, the war had transformed medicine in the United States. Systems of triage, ambulance services, large-scale hospitals, and nursing corps had become established practices. Though born of necessity and steeped in suffering, these changes laid the foundation for modern medical care. And so, one must pause to ask, when we think of the Civil War as a turning point in politics and society, do we also recognize it as a turning point in medicine where the lessons of suffering quietly built the structures that would care for generations to come? Asterisk, by 1864, the Civil War had reached its most brutal years, and the world of medicine stood at the heart of its endurance. Every major battle brought new waves of wounded, and with them, new lessons. Surgeons, nurses, and volunteers had by then adapted to the scale of suffering, yet they continued to face overwhelming numbers, limited resources, and the constant shadow of disease. What had once been improvisation had hardened into systems. But those systems were still stretched to breaking. The great campaigns of that year, Grant's Overland Campaign, Sherman's march to the sea, produced casualty lists longer than ever before. Ambulance corps carried the wounded from fields churned with mud and smoke, their wheels cutting deep ruts into the earth. The sight of those wagons became familiar, men groaning as they were jostled over rough roads, the smell of blood mingling with sweat and dust. At field hospitals, surgeons braced themselves for days of endless work, sometimes amputating limbs until their arms shook with fatigue. But the systems introduced earlier in the war let immense triage. The expansion of large hospitals, the organization of supply networks made a difference. Soldiers wounded in 1864 often stood a better chance of survival than those struck in 1861. Not because medicine had suddenly advanced, but because experience and organization had improved. The war itself became a harsh teacher, forcing doctors to abandon old habits and embrace new practices of efficiency, sanitation, and care. Large hospitals in cities like Washington, Richmond, and Philadelphia resembled entire communities. The sprawling facilities held thousands of patients, arranged in long wards with rows of beds, kitchens prepared food, laundries cleaned soiled linens, and chapels provided spiritual comfort. Surgeons moved from ward to ward, checking wounds, adjusting bandages, and deciding who might recover. Nurses distributed medicine, read letters aloud to men too weak to hold a pen, kept order in spaces where despair might otherwise overwhelm. For many soldiers, these hospitals became strange homes. Recovery was slow, marked by boredom as much as pain. Men passed the hours carving wood, writing letters, or reading when books were available. Some grew restless, longing to return to their regiments, while others accepted that they would never march again. The hospital world was suspended between life and death, between war and peace, between despair and hope. Amputations remained the most visible marker of Civil War medicine. By war's end, tens of thousands of men had lost limbs, becoming the largest population of amputees the United States had ever known. Prosthetic makers flourished, advertising devices that promised mobility and dignity. The government began subsidizing artificial limbs for veterans, one of the earliest forms of federal support for the disabled. Yet the reality was often harsh. Its prosthetics were clumsy, painful, and prone to breaking. Many veterans abandoned them, relying instead on crutches or wheelchairs. The physical loss was compounded by social stigma as communities adjusted to the sight of men permanently marked by war. But the war also spurred innovation. The sheer demand for prosthetics pushed inventors to improve designs, experimenting with lighter materials and more functional joints. These advances, though imperfect, represented early steps toward modern rehabilitation. Similarly, the organization of ambulance services, the standardization of triage, and the emphasis on sanitation laid groundwork for peacetime medicine. Akana, the lessons of war would outlive the conflict itself. Nurses remained central to this transformation. Clara Barton continued to work at the front, her dedication inspiring others. In Richmond, Sally Tompkins Hospital maintained its reputation for low mortality, even as Confederate resources dwindled. Countless other women, whose names were not preserved in history, labored in obscurity, boiling water, scrubbing floors, and tending to wounds. Their contributions shifted public perception, making nursing a profession rather than a temporary duty. The U.S. Sanitary Commission expanded its reach, inspecting camps, distributing supplies, and lobbying for better conditions. Its fairs raised money and morale, blending civilian and military effort in unprecedented ways. In the Confederacy, women's aid societies performed similar roles, though with fewer resources. These organizations represented a new model of civic engagement, linking households and armies in a shared struggle for survival. Psychological wounds, however, remained largely invisible. Soldiers wrote of sleeplessness, of trembling, of haunting memories of battle and hospital wards. Doctors labeled these conditions vaguely soldier's heart, nostalgia, but offered little treatment beyond rest. Families struggled to understand why returning men seemed changed, why they withdrew into silence or bursts of anger. The war preserved bodies more often than minds, leaving hidden scars that would shape lives long after 1865. Asterisk, even as the war neared its end, disease continued to claim lives. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, and malaria swept through camps and hospitals. The crowded conditions of prisons like Andersonville revealed the extreme consequences of neglect, where thousands died from starvation and disease. These horrors underscored the limits of Civil War medicine, reminding all that progress. By the time the guns fell silent in April 1865, American medicine was transformed. The war had not solved the mysteries of infection germ. Theory would only gain wide acceptance in the decades to come. It had created systems that saved lives on a scale previously unimagined. The organization of ambulance services, the rise of nursing, the construction of large hospitals, and the introduction of triage were direct legacies of the conflict. For the survivors, the memory of Civil War medicine lingered in visible and invisible ways. Communities saw veterans with crutches and empty sleeves. Families cared for men weakened by disease. Nurses carried memories of hospital wards filled with groans and prayers. Surgeons reflected on lessons learned under fire, lessons that would guide the next generation of doctors. And so, the story of Civil War medicine is not only about crude amputations or shortages of supplies. It is also about adaptation, resilience, and the quiet progress born of necessity. It reminds us that history's great transformations often occur not in moments of triumph, but in the slow, grinding struggle against suffering. And one must ask, when we look back on the Civil War, do we see clearly enough the doctors with bone saws, the nurses boiling bandages, the soldiers enduring pain, and the communities adjusting to life, marked forever by wounds, both seen and unseen? Asterisk, when the Civil War began in 1861, the United States was a country still learning the possibilities of its new technologies. The railroad and the telegraph were barely 3 decades old, yet they would become as decisive to the conflict as rifles and cannons. For the first time in history, armies moved on iron rails and communicated through electric wires. The war would prove not only a clash of men and ideas, but also a test of how machines could carry nations into the future. Imagine the soundscape of the war. Beyond the battlefield, the steady rumble of locomotives pulling boxcars, the whistle of steam echoing across valleys, and the metallic clicking of telegraph keys tapping out coded messages. These were not the sounds of muskets or drums, yet they defined the Civil War as much as any volley of fire. They were the background hum of a modern war, a war carried not only by men on foot, but by networks of steel and copper. The North entered the war with a tremendous advantage. In 1861, the Union possessed more than 20,000 miles of railroad track, while the Confederacy had only about 9,000. Even more important, Northern lines were more standardized and connected, linking industrial centers with ports and agricultural regions. Southern railroads, by contrast, were fragmented, many built to connect cotton plantations to local markets, rather than to move armies or supplies over long distances. The war revealed the consequences of this difference almost immediately. Railroads changed the very pace of war. In earlier conflicts, armies marched on foot, supplies carried by wagon trains that moved slowly along dirt roads. During the Civil War, entire regiments could be transported by rail in hours rather than days. At Bull Run in 1861, Confederate reinforcements famously arrived by train from the Shenandoah Valley, surprising Union forces and helping secure a Southern victory. Newspapers marveled at the speed, calling it the first battle won by the railroad, the Union. However, soon mastered the larger art of railway warfare. The U.S. Military Railroad, established in 1862, became the largest railroad operation in the world at the time, under the direction of Daniel McCallum and Herman Haupt. Engineers rebuilt bridges, laid track, and managed the constant flow of trains carrying soldiers, weapons, and food. They developed techniques for rapidly repairing destroyed lines, sometimes rebuilding bridges within days. Railroads became lifelines, or iron rails as critical as any battle plan. The telegraph added another layer of speed and coordination. Before its invention, generals relied on couriers, whose journeys by horse might take hours or days. Now, messages traveled instantly across hundreds of miles. Abraham Lincoln himself spent long hours in the War Department's telegraph office, reading dispatches from the front. The clicking of telegraph keys connected the White House directly to battlefields, a new intimacy between politics and war. Lincoln valued the telegraph so highly that he often stayed overnight in the office, waiting for updates. For generals, the telegraph offered new possibilities, but also new challenges. Orders could be transmitted quickly, but wires were vulnerable to cutting or interception. Both armies employed telegraph corps to maintain and protect lines. Union forces used insulated wire that could be strung quickly along poles or even laid across the ground. Confederate troops, short of supplies, sometimes salvaged wire from local communities, stripping it from fences to patch their lines. Cipher systems attempted to secure these communications. Messages were often encoded with simple substitution. Ciphers, though skilled operators, could sometimes break them. The telegraph thus introduced an early form of electronic warfare spying. Intercepting and decoding messages became as crucial as sending them. The combination of railroad and telegraph created a new kind of warfare, one that was faster, more coordinated, and more dependent on logistics than ever before. Armies that could not feed themselves, supply themselves, or communicate their movements could not survive. Battles were no longer fought only by courage and tactics on the field. They were shaped by the unseen work of engineers, telegraph operators, and railroad workers behind the lines. Railroad workers became soldiers of a different kind. They laid track under fire, repaired bridges blown apart by explosives, and risked ambushes while guarding trains. Telegraph operators, too, lived under constant strain, tapping out messages in tents or field stations close to battle lines. Many were teenagers, trained quickly and sent to war with keys and wires instead of rifles. Their work rarely appeared in headlines, but without them, generals would have been blind and armies immobile. The Confederacy's weaknesses in this regard grew more severe as the war dragged on. Lacking both industrial capacity and spare parts, Southern railroads deteriorated. Engines broke down, tracks were thin, and there were few resources to repair them. Union raids targeted these vulnerabilities, tearing up rails, twisting them into Sherman's neckties around trees, and burning depots. Each destroyed mile of track cut deeper into the South's ability to sustain itself. Yet, even in the South, railroads left their mark. The movement of Confederate troops by rail allowed armies to fight across vast distances, prolonging the conflict far beyond what would have been possible in earlier eras. Telegraph lines carried orders and reports that kept far-flung commanders connected. Without these technologies, the Confederacy might have collapsed much sooner. For civilians, the presence of railroads and telegraphs reshaped daily life. Towns near major rail lines became hubs of military activity, their stations crowded with soldiers, supplies, and refugees. Telegraph offices drew anxious families, hoping for news of battles or loved ones. Newspapers relied on telegraph reports, printing war news with a speed that astonished readers. For the first time, civilians at breakfast could read about battles fought the day before. Their connection to distant fields made immediate by electric wires. The Civil War, was not only a conflict of armies, but also of networks of steel, rails stretching across landscapes and wires humming with electric signals. These networks carried soldiers, food, weapons, and words. They turned the vast geography of the United States into a battlefield where distance itself was no longer the same obstacle it had been. And so, one might wonder, in remembering the Civil War, do we think too much of the roar of cannon and too little of the quiet clicking of telegraph keys and the low rumble of trains, those sounds that carried the war forward, unseen yet decisive? Asterisk, by 1862, the importance of railroads and telegraphs had become undeniable. The war was no longer a matter of short campaigns. It had grown into a drawn-out struggle, stretching across hundreds of miles. Armies marched deep into hostile territory. Supply lines extended dangerously thin, and communications had to cross rivers, mountains, and states. In this context, the hum of telegraph wires and the steady pulse of locomotives became as vital as gunpowder. Railroads shaped campaigns in ways that generals quickly recognized. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman later said, "The Army and the railroad are Siamese twins. One without the other would die." His campaigns through Tennessee and Georgia depended on railroads carrying endless trains of supplies. Thousands of tons of food, ammunition, clothing, and medical equipment moved southward on iron rails. When guerrilla fighters destroyed sections of track, Union engineers rushed to rebuild them, sometimes laying new rails within hours. Entire regiments of construction crews became as important as soldiers with rifles. Asterisk. The Union's U.S. Military Railroad, directed by Herman Haupt, was a marvel of organization. Haupt developed prefabricated bridge designs that could be assembled quickly in the field. His engineers carried with them standardized iron parts and timbers, allowing them to reconstruct bridges blown apart by retreating Confederates. One observer described watching a bridge rebuilt in less than 10 days, its timbers rising like a skeleton against the sky, trains rolling across before the smoke of battle had even cleared. Confederate railroads, by contrast, strained under the weight of war. Went originally to move cotton from plantations to ports. Their lines were not designed for heavy, sustained military use. Track gauges varied from region to region, meaning a train might reach the end of one line and have to unload its cargo onto another train with different wheels. With limited industrial capacity, the South struggled to replace worn-out locomotives and rails. By 1863, many Confederate lines had fallen into disrepair, forcing soldiers to march long distances where once trains had carried them. The telegraph, meanwhile, shortened the distance between commanders and the front. Union generals coordinated multi-pronged offensives through rapid exchanges of messages, while President Lincoln himself often read battlefield reports within minutes of their transmission. He became a familiar figure in the War Department's telegraph office, sometimes drafting his own messages to generals in the field. Lincoln grasped intuitively that the telegraph was not just a tool, but a revolution in command. The Confederacy also used the telegraph, but with fewer lines and greater vulnerability. Union cavalry raids often targeted telegraph wires, cutting communications and plunging Confederate commanders into isolation. Confederate operators responded with ingenuity using portable telegraph kits that could be strung along fences or trees. Some carried spools of wire on wagons, laying makeshift lines as armies moved. Still, the shortage of resources meant Confederate communication was more fragile. Coordination often faltered at critical moments. Telegraph operators became a distinct corps of soldiers, their hands as important as any musket. They tapped out endless strings of dots and dashes, their ears trained to recognize rhythms of code. Many were young men, barely out of school, trusted with carrying secrets that could shape battles. Some lived in tents pitched beside battlefields, wires strung hastily through trees, their instruments clicking even as cannon fire roared in the distance. The war also revealed the vulnerability of these technologies. Guerrilla fighters learned to sabotage railroads by prying up rails, burning depots, or derailing trains. Telegraph wires were cut with knives or yanked down by poles. Both armies developed countermeasures. Union troops sometimes strung dummy wires to confuse Confederate scouts, while Confederate raiders left false messages on captured telegraph lines. The War of Steel and Copper became as much about deception and repair as about movement and speed. Civilian life along railroads and telegraph lines changed dramatically. Towns that once saw only occasional trains became military hubs, their stations crowded with soldiers and supplies. Telegraph offices buzzed with activity, operators relaying not only military orders but also news for newspapers. Civilians gathered outside offices, waiting for bulletins posted on walls. For the first time, the American public experienced war almost in real time. Reports of battles reached cities within hours, their details spread by newspapers the next morning. The telegraph thus created a new kind of war reporting, binding the home front more tightly to the front lines. Railroads also carried the wounded. After major battles, trains were converted into hospital cars, with soldiers lying on straw beds as locomotives carried them to larger facilities in cities. These journeys were rough, the tracks jolting wounds painfully, but they represented progress compared to the slow agony of wagon transport. For families, the sight of trains carrying wounded men became a familiar and haunting reminder of the cost of war. The industrial power of the Union meant that by 1863, northern railroads had become arteries of an enormous war machine. Coal, iron, food, and manufactured goods flowed along tracks to support the armies. The Confederacy, meanwhile, saw its lines worn down, its engines breaking, its depots emptying. Each mile of torn-up track, each stolen locomotive, weakened its ability to win the fight. Sherman's march through Georgia famously targeted railroads, its men heating rails over fires and twisting them around trees. These Sherman's neckties symbolized the destruction of the South's infrastructure, crippling its capacity to resist. The telegraph also became a weapon of morale. Rumors and misinformation spread quickly, sometimes intentionally. Both sides intercepted and altered messages, sowing confusion. Newspapers, hungry for news, often printed reports that were inaccurate or exaggerated. Families at home experienced the war through these filtered wires, sometimes rejoicing at a victory, only to learn later it had been overstated, or despairing at a defeat that turned out to be smaller than reported. The speed of the telegraph carried not only facts, but also uncertainties, reshaping how Americans experienced truth during war. By the time 1863 turned to 1864, the marriage of railroads and telegraphs had transformed military strategy. Generals no longer thought solely in terms of men and muskets. They thought in terms of supply lines, communication hubs, and infrastructure. To cut a railroad was to wound an army. To sever a telegraph line was to blind a commander. The war had revealed a new reality. Modern conflict was as much about controlling networks as about winning battles. And so, one might pause and reflect. In an age when armies still marched on foot and fought with bayonets, was the true revolution of the Civil War found not in tactics, but in the unseen power of rails and wires that carried men, supplies, and messages across a nation in turmoil. Asterisk, by 1864. The clatter of trains and the clicking of telegraph keys had become the background rhythm of the war. Generals no longer imagined campaigns without them. Soldiers no longer marched without relying on their steady support. The Civil War had revealed itself to be not only a struggle of armies, but a struggle of network steel tracks and copper wires binding together a nation even as it tore itself apart. The railroads had by then become lifelines for Union armies advancing deeper into the Confederacy. Sherman's campaigns in Georgia depended on a single, tenuous rail line running back to Nashville. Train after train carried rations, ammunition, uniforms, and medical supplies down those tracks. Sherman himself admitted that without railroads, his campaigns would have collapsed. Engineers followed the army as closely as cavalry, repairing lines the moment they were torn up. When Confederate raiders struck burning bridges or prying up rails, Union crews replaced them with astonishing speed. Some accounts describe entire spans rebuilt in a single day. Iron and timber rising like scaffolds of survival in the Confederacy. Railroads staggered under the weight of war. Engines wore out, wheels cracked, and rails bent without replacements. The South lacked both ironworks and factories large enough to sustain repairs. Each destroyed bridge or depot was a wound that could not easily heal. By 1864, Confederate soldiers often marched hungry because trains could not bring food fast enough. Ammunition arrived late, uniforms grew ragged, and horses went without feed. The once proud rails that had carried cotton to ports now lay twisted, or silent, relics of a crumbling infrastructure. The Union understood this vulnerability and struck at it directly. Sherman's march to the sea targeted not only farms, but also railroads. His soldiers pried up rails, heated them over bonfires, and twisted them into grotesque spirals around trees. These Sherman's neckties became symbols of industrial war destruction, aimed not at soldiers, but at the systems that sustained them. With each rail twisted and depot burned, the Confederacy's ability to fight drained away. The telegraph was no less decisive. By 1864, Lincoln's reliance on the War Department's telegraph office had grown constant. He spent hours each day there, reading dispatches as soon as they arrived, shaping policy with the immediacy of electric communication. For the first time in American history, a president directed war with near-instant updates from distant battlefields. The White House and the front were bound together by humming wires, shrinking distance in ways unimaginable a generation earlier. Asterisk, commanders in the field used the telegraph to coordinate movements across hundreds of miles. Messages flew between corps and divisions, aligning attacks that would have been impossible in earlier wars. Yet the telegraph was fragile. Lines could be cut with a single knife or torn down by raiders. Operators traveled with armies, stringing temporary wires through trees or along fences, creating makeshift networks that moved as the front shifted. Some even carried portable telegraph kits, tapping messages into the ground itself when poles could not be erected. The operators themselves became quiet heroes. Often teenagers or young men, they learned to translate the rhythms of dots and dashes almost by instinct. Their ears could distinguish one operator's hand from another's, recognizing familiar patterns like voices. They worked in tents, barns, or wagons, their fingers tapping furiously as generals dictated orders. Some stayed at their posts, even as shells exploded nearby, determined to send one more message before fleeing. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers, yet their labor carried the war as surely as the rifles in soldiers' hands. The telegraph also carried news beyond the battlefield. For civilians, it transformed the experience of war. Newspapers received reports within hours, printing casualty lists and battlefield accounts the next morning. Families gathered outside telegraph offices, reading bulletins posted on doors. Hope and dread pulsed along those wires, binding home fronts to battlefronts with a speed that was both miraculous and cruel. Never before had war entered households so quickly, its victories and losses arriving faster than families could prepare their hearts. Yet, the telegraph also spread confusion. Errors in transmission, exaggerations by reporters, or intentional misinformation could mislead entire communities. Both armies learned to intercept and alter messages, sowing doubt. A single false report could shift morale, convincing towns that victories had been won or lost when reality was different. The telegraph carried truth, but it also carried uncertainty, teaching Americans that speed of communication did not always mean accuracy. The combined power of railroads and telegraphs created a new kind of generalship. Military leaders who mastered logistics and communication triumphed. Those who ignored them faltered. Grant and Sherman understood that to control rail lines was to control armies. Confederate leaders, struggling with failing infrastructure, often fought blind or hungry. The war had shifted from valor on the battlefield to strategy in supply depots and telegraph offices for ordinary workers. This transformation meant new roles. Railroad engineers, brakemen, firemen, and telegraph clerks became essential. They were soldiers without uniforms, laboring in mud, smoke, and heat. Some lay trapped under gunfire, others tapped out orders as shells fell nearby. Their stories, often overlooked, remind us that wars are carried as much by labor as by combat. By 1865, as the Confederacy collapsed, its railroads lay in ruins. Tracks twisted, bridges burned, engines rusted, depots silent. Telegraph lines sagged or lay in coils on the ground. The South's infrastructure, already fragile, had been systematically dismantled. The Union, by contrast, emerged with a stronger, more integrated rail network and a new appreciation for the telegraph as an instrument of governance and war. The legacy of these technologies stretched far beyond Appomattox. After the war, railroads expanded even faster, binding the continent together. The telegraph became the backbone of national communication, linking cities and industries. Both technologies, proven on battlefields, would drive the United States into a new era of industrial growth. Yet, beneath these triumphs lay quieter stories. It's the mother, waiting outside a telegraph office for news of her son. It's the railroad worker who spent nights repairing track under lantern light, knowing trains would carry food to soldiers who might never return. The operator tapping final words for a dying soldier to send home. These were not grand battles, but they were the threads that held the war together. And so, one must ask, when we recall the Civil War's epic battles and speeches, do we remember? Enough the rails that carried men and the wires that carried words, the technologies that not only decided campaigns, but also reshaped what it meant to wage war in the modern age. Asterisk, when the Civil War began in April 1861. The place of African Americans in the conflict was uncertain, contested, and deliberately limited. In both the Union and the Confederacy, leaders hesitated to define what role black men and women would play. Yet, as the war stretched on, necessity and courage reshaped those boundaries. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors had served the Union cause, and their contribution proved not only decisive for victory, but also transformative for the meaning of freedom in America. You can imagine the early days of the conflict.